Hi, my name is Jason T. Ingram. I've been doing some series on mental health, especially when it comes to what I call cheap mental health and even fake mental health. And it's interesting how many things are out there that resemble mental health that don't have the clinical background and especially that don't have the results. And then there are some things that are not really considered mental health that do the work of mental health and do a pretty damn good job. And then there is clinical mental health, expensive psychotherapy that you have people that have doctorates and master's degree in, clinical therapy, psychotherapy. And a lot of times they call it marriage and family therapy, and now they call it social work. But somebody who's a therapist could actually have a degree in social work and actually be a psychotherapist. And so I find that interesting that there's so many labels for that. So anyways, I did a couple other videos about rural mental health, and I find that I have a lot more to say, and I have a lot of ideas on things that we could do to hopefully start over, because the system that we have works for certain people and it's marketed to certain people. I hate to say the word marketed, but mental health is an industry. It's a multi-million, billion, whatever dollar industry, and it's getting cheaper and cheaper. And at the same time, big healthcare organizations and even a lot of providers are getting more and more money. And I know because I look every year or so at what it is for an hour of psychotherapy. Might have been $100-something 10 years ago. And then they'll schedule them back to back. So they would do like 55 minutes. And then some providers were, we're doing 50 minutes now. And then now they go, I have to do 45 minutes because they're scheduling them in 45-minute increments. So they put them in back to back. Typically what I see now is 50 minutes, and the psychotherapist only has 10 minutes to go to the bathroom for prep time, to read notes, which they never do. Occasionally you show up to your therapy appointment and your provider will actually review the notes from the last week or two and know the questions to ask. And some folks, like I had a therapist recently who had kind of not an eidetic memory, but pretty close. And she was able to remember a lot of details about a lot of her clients, even new ones. And it's really hit or miss as far as what kind of therapist you're going to get. But here's one thing I've noticed. No matter where I live, I've gotten therapy out in Kentucky and Ohio, out in rural areas and suburban areas and urban areas. And typically you get folks that have a cultural background of what I call educational culture. And this is a huge issue when it comes to rural mental health, especially for men. Because if you know anything about rural American culture and you hang around with men, you're going to find that they are not very fond of educated, urban, especially progressive culture and those types of views. The main reason is simply because in most places around America you go to, and this is probably true for a lot of other countries as well, is that the population centers are making a lot of decisions over a little piece of land that has to do with big pieces of land with less people. However, they live a totally different lifestyle. They have different needs, and they have a whole different value system as well. And what happens, especially in Oregon, we're called a blue state. And in fact, we're one of the most liberal states, and it's concentrated in the Willamette Valley. So really, you only have about maybe 100, maybe 200 mile stretch of the Willamette River and a couple other places along the coast where you have a predominant culture that is based in putting a lot of value on education. And then you have most of Oregon where they put value on hard work and honor, respect, and honesty, and a lot of other good things. It's just that they feel left out. And so what happens is and I'm just talking about men in particular, when guys need mental health care, and a lot of guys are really fucked up everywhere, whether they live out in the country or whether they live in the city, the statistics of, 1 out of 4 people are going to have some type of mental health needs. And then there's smaller percentages as far as how many of these guys have, mood disorders, especially substance abuse issues. And even bigger is trauma, PTSD. It's very common in women, probably more common in women. It's just that men deal with it differently. And we need to work with men differently when it comes to trauma. And the big thing I get at is that we don't make men feel safe when it comes to their trauma because we're too busy trying to protect ourselves from either a threat, or usually it's a perceived threat. We get a guy that comes in and he looks scary, then, we're going to be reaching for our phone or our gun or the security button or whatever it is. And you're not going to make the guy feel safe because basically we're judging that guy. And especially when it has to do with sitting down with somebody from an educated community, with their language, with their big words, with all their polite stuff. And it's weird how some people act polite and it's offensive. It's like, excuse me, sir, and they talk all clinical and let's table that and let's review and I want you to acknowledge this. And they kind of, I get around mental health nonprofits in this city and they have a vocabulary that's different. And it's all about, we need to affirm these people, we need to tolerate these groups, and we need to learn about blah, 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 blah. And it all kind of sounds like, those South Park characters, when they're making fun of teachers and adults. They kind of remind me of that too, like, children, let's calm down. And it's really condescending when you get a provider that talks to somebody who, let's say, who's been doing hard labor for 40 years or something like that, and they get around somebody who's just getting out of college and they're like, okay, why do I want to tell this person my problems, and how are they going to give me any advice, and why is it worth my time to drive all this way? Because a lot of times with rural communities there's a lot of driving involved and there's a lot of money involved, a lot of time and effort, and it's humiliating because, rural American men, most of them I know that I've talked to would see going into some type of psychotherapy as, I failed, this is this thing that I shouldn't be doing, it's humiliating, I wish nobody would know about it, or typically it's my wife's making me do this, or it's because they have some mandatory thing because anger management, or maybe they got into legal issues, or very common substance abuse issues. So if a guy gets into a bar fight and they give him a choice, and based on what state you're in or what kind of judge that they're dealing with, okay, you can either go through this mandatory mental health thing, or you're going to have to pay these fines, or you're going to have to go to jail, or maybe even prison or something like that. We consider you a threat. But if you go through these programs and all this kind of stuff, then, and so, they're trying to pick the lesser of 2 or 3 evils. A lot of times they just kind of go through the motions, and they get a culture and a type of people that really get on their nerves, and they basically block them out. And there's a lot of people that have gone through therapy with the wrong motives, especially if they're forced to do it, and they basically just block out the whole process. It's interesting how I've met men who have gone to therapy and you would never know it because they just like, I got to sit with this shrink for 50 minutes and just, I tell them what I think they want to hear, and I make them happy and blah, 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 and then I'm ready to get out of there because I'm so tired of my head getting shrunk and them telling me how to live my life, and they don't know what it's like and all this kind of stuff. And that's another big thing too, is that most of these providers, And it's funny because a lot of providers I notice live with acute mental disorders, and they're in it for some weird reasons. Like they want to fix themselves, or they want to think that they can relate to low functioning people. And it's really weird how some of them say like, oh, I can relate because I deal with some anxiety and depression. And then it's like, I wish they wouldn't have said that. I wish they would have said, no, I don't know what it's like for you to live with that kind of fear, with that kind of paranoia, with that kind of anxiety, with that kind of trauma and that kind of background. And that would be a provider who would admit the fact that, no, I'm not going to try to relate to you. I'm not going to pretend to relate to you. I'm going to listen to you and try to relate and try to learn what it's like to be you. And then, if they're a good therapist, especially in the last several decades, there's been a trend of counseling as not, I'm telling you what to do, what to think, and how to behave and how to talk. That's sort of an old model. That's sort of a clinical model of counsel. Here it is over the last several years is the counselor has to guide the conversations to get the patient to come to their own conclusions and make their own decisions. And that's very empowering. And it's hard because especially if you get somebody who's not very proactive and you're just asking them questions and they don't come up with these ideas, and then a lot of times somebody just sits there and tells their problems and they don't even get to the root of what's really going on for various reasons. And they kind of go through the motions, and then sometimes even if they do talk about their problems, they don't end up with any kind of solutions, or they don't end up with any kind of hope or something to look forward to. And then there's a lot of therapists that give homework. I don't mind homework. Every other time they give it to me, it's total bullshit and it doesn't work. I mentioned this before, I think, but one of them said, when you're having a panic attack, put your head or your face in a bucket of ice water. I'm like, yeah, right. So I tried it, and of course, it probably works for somebody who maybe is suffering from acute disorders, but I tell you, for the most part, stuff like that doesn't work. And it's an ever experimental industry because it is so difficult to treat trauma. It is time consuming to treat trauma. And you have to have somebody who's really good at it, somebody who's very compassionate, somebody who makes their patient feel safe, and who really has somebody who's receptive and dedicated to healing. And the big thing is most people that live with trauma have really rough lives and very rough relationships, because traumatized people are hard to be around it. And this is something I wanted to say for a while, and I don't know if I said it on camera, but I hope I did. But if I haven't, here it is. Trauma breeds more trauma. And a good example of that is when someone's traumatized, it's really hard for them to do their job, especially when they're working with the public. And they're going to get nervous, and they're not going to talk right, they're not going to behave right, and they're going to lose jobs. I know, because I've had like about 4 dozen jobs in my life, and most of that was over a 12-year period. I was lucky to be able to fall into situations, even though I've been homeless and at-risk homeless in times in my life, that I've never had to be homeless for more than, several days or weeks at a time. And folks that lose their jobs, lose their house, because traumatized people end up with severe personality disorders. Most people interpret those as character flaws, and most people think those kinds of people are unsafe to be around, whether they are unsafe or not. And so what I'm talking about is trauma breeding more trauma. So when you get a traumatized person, they lose their job, they lose their house, they're going to end up in situations that are more traumatic, and it's a downward spiral. And by that time, it's really hard to help these people, especially when it comes to the fact that they're suffering so much that the only thing that helps them is some kind of hard drugs, and they're going to do whatever it takes to get those, and boom, we've created criminals. And sometimes the best way to deal with traumatized people that are somewhere in this cycle is to lock them up, throw away the key. And that seems to be what's happening in America a lot. Our prison system is bizarre compared to most other countries. And it is an industry. There's so many private prisons now that are getting this cheap labor, and it's really sad. It almost resembles some type of fascist country that has work camps, although it's in the context of, well, these people are criminals. Well, how did they become criminals, and how did we create environments in order to create criminals? So one of the best things about, trying to reduce how many men are in prison is to not create criminals, to make them feel safe, give them access to safe environments, give them access to healing that actually works. And there's a lot of rural American men that are in the prison system that shouldn't be there, just for the simple fact that they didn't have access to mental health care that works, that's affordable, that's close by, and that makes them feel safe. And so I'm going to tell you some stories, and these are really offensive because I'm going to really step on some toes, especially when it comes to the educated community, because this is such a desperate need, especially when we're dealing with a demographic that has a culture that typically, in my experience, is okay with showing more aggression. And then when you get them into an educated type context like a mental health office, and they raise their voice, and everybody's going to get scared, and they're going to freak out about them. The thing is, they need to find a place where they can be themselves. And unless they're being abusive or something, there's nothing wrong with somebody that just has a gruff attitude. I used to go into mental health nonprofit offices, and I had just been living in, rural Ohio and Kentucky and Alaska. And even though I'm a product of educated, urban, progressive, liberal culture, I spent enough time in the country that's really fucked up my personality. So I got around these people, and they were scared of me. But, I was 6'2" and 250 something pounds, and they didn't want me around. It's just because my voice was loud, my personality was big, and I was big. And I had a big beard, and, I think the only thing that saved me was the fact that they knew I was gay, and these kinds of people feel safe around gays, which I thought was funny, because around the country, they didn't feel safe around me. They didn't want their kids around me and stuff like that. But what happens is that when you get folks that went to college for mental health stuff, and they get a job in a rural community, most of the time they don't understand the culture, they don't understand the needs, and they end up getting scared of these men. And this is where it's going to sound racist and sexist, and I don't care, because this is too important in order to save on, to protect our little politically correct world that we're trying to create. And that's okay in an urban setting. It's okay to have a mental health office that's full of rainbow flags and stuff in different languages, and trying to make it tolerant and affirming to all these, minority groups and stuff like that. And that's okay because we have a lot of minorities in rural areas as well. What we do need is we need an office that caters entirely to one demographic, and to not try to do anything to make them think that they're excluded and that they're going to feel unsafe. So here's what my perfect rural American mental health office would be, and I'm going to compare this to an office that I visited about a month or two ago here in rural Oregon. And I get there, and one thing I found that was interesting, and again, this is going to sound really sexist, but I don't care, because this is important. I want to put aside this stuff right now so that we can try to reach a demographic. Everybody there were women around the front desk and the providers and everything. I'm sure there were some male counselors there that were on staff somewhere, and I'm sure the person that runs the whole organization is probably a man. But here's the thing, if a guy goes in there and he wants to share his feelings, and he's got a wife that's constantly trying to get in his head about how he's feeling, and he's scared to reveal everything because there's a lot of violent thoughts going on in his head, he's probably not going to feel safe to share it around a bunch of women, even at the front desk. And there's another thing too, is that the gal at the front desk was really unfriendly and did not really even listen to what my needs were. I was there because of a crisis situation. Well, fill out this paperwork and we'll get you on the waiting list and blah, 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 and all this. It's like, no. I was here because I made a call ahead of time, because there's a crisis worker here. Well, we don't have that, blah, blah, blah. And I said, no, listen, I was told there was a crisis worker here, and I don't want to fill out all this paperwork. Can you just get me in to see this person? Oh, okay. Well, it was obvious that English was her second language, and that can be really triggering for people, especially when you a guy who's got a lot of anger issues and who's lost his job because there's a lot of migrant workers coming in, and whether he thinks they're documented or undocumented, he's going to be scared of people of color because he's going to feel threatened because he's seen his jobs or maybe a lot of other jobs taken away by folks from other cultures and other countries coming in. And so that's going to make it more difficult for him to want to open up and trust these people and to feel safe. So, what if we made a clinic in rural America that was run entirely by white men? That would really piss off the educational community. But it would have to be a grassroots project started from people in a rural setting, and even the waiting room needs to look like guy stuff. The name of it needs to sound like guy stuff instead of some kind of care clinic. I had this idea of doing like a cartoon series, which I'd love to do about this because it really is funny. And I think if people laugh at some of these ideas, they might end up challenge, them to think, well, I wonder if maybe we could try some of that somewhere along the line. But, calling it the man cave or the man den or something like that. And having a bunch of lazy boy recliners in a room with pictures of fishing and hunting and military stuff, and making it look like a man cave, and not putting in a water feature and not putting in, a thing where you can make green tea on a Keurig machine and stuff like that. Don't make it look like a fucking nail salon. If you want guys to go in there and to feel safe, because the big thing is that guys have to feel safe to open up, and if they're hiding all their stuff, then they're never going to deal with their shit, and they have to feel safe and they have to trust people in order to really open up and reveal what's really going on. And here's another thing that's really going to piss off the educated community, and this is where people can get into a lot of trouble, but you can get into trouble either way, and I've mentioned this before, and I don't have a solution to it, but I know that we could come up with a solution if we find something that works. But if we have a clinic that specifically states that they are not mandatory reporters, then that might get men to open up, especially men that are prone to violent crime. If they have somebody safe they can talk to about what's going on inside of them, especially if they've never acted on it. Now, if they admit to a crime, then I think anybody should be a mandatory reporter, whether they're in a position of influence or whether they're a provider or not. It's I think part of the laws in America that if someone says, I've been putting this child in danger, or this person in danger, or whatever, and I've done this to them, it's like, okay, I'm sorry, but if you say something like that, I'm going to have to report you. But here's the thing, is that if a guy says that I have this much rage that I feel like nuking, like there was this one guy who was a real hardcore conservative, and he was a military veteran, and I heard him, yelling and screaming one time about, and it was funny, this was in Portland too. He said, I want to leave Portland, I want to nuke the whole city, I just want to nuke this whole damn city, and blah, 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 and stuff like that. Well, that really scared certain people, but that's how he was feeling. He was feeling excluded from an educated community, and he had a severe case of PTSD. He was a military veteran, and although most of these mental health places are veteran friendly, I don't think they understand veterans. I think most of these people that go to college for mental health stuff have no idea what it's like, especially in a combat situation. This guy was working on an aircraft carrier, and he told me some things that were so scary about what he saw and what he experienced that I was just like, I can't relate to that. And I can't imagine that guy going into a therapy office and trusting these educated, progressive, liberal people with some problems that he had were very severe. And so another thing too is outreach, is that it's hard to find these places. You have to call the hospital and get a referral, and you have to go to Google Maps. And this provider that I went to, they didn't even accept Medicare. In fact, I couldn't find any mental health office that accepted Medicare. And they say, well, we do a sliding scale and stuff like that. And typically what happens is if you're on Medicare, they won't even do a sliding scale. And that's a part of discrimination. So that pretty much eliminates a lot of seniors. And a lot of seniors need a lot of help. And as we know, a lot of violent crime in recent years has been done by folks that were over the age of 60. And so we also have a demographic of, young, middle, and old men that have different needs and different levels of trauma. But we've seen this from Columbine all the way up to the Las Vegas shooting, is that you never know when a man is going to, and I hate to use this term, snap. You just never know when he's going to just say, hey, I've been treated unfairly and I can't stand it anymore, and I have to do something. I have to balance this abuse of power in some way to get my power back, to feel like I'm in control. And if we don't give him an environment to where he can resolve that somehow, then they are prone to violent crime. And it's amazing how many men don't commit violent crime who are capable of it. And I would say the majority of guys that would want to commit a random act of violence will never do it. And if we criminalize those who feel like they want to do something but have no real intention to do it, then we've just cut out a big group of people. We've made them feel unsafe, especially if there's a mandatory reporter that says, hi, police, I have this client and he said that he wants to go in and do some horrible crime. And the police go over there, and that's going to get him paranoid. It's going to make him feel more unsafe. The problem is, and of course, this is the problem that everybody knows when it comes to mandatory reporting. It's there to keep people safe. And if a guy says that I feel like, going into a church or a school or somewhere where there's vulnerable people that are unarmed and doing something absolutely devastating and horrible and disgusting, and if he ends up doing it, then that person's liable. Which is kind of sad, because a lot of it has to do with the providers really wanting to save their own butt. However, if we find a way to decriminalize rage that's never acted on in a creative way that makes everybody feel safe, then that would be wonderful. And that would be something to implement in a rural American, especially other places that are prone to violence, like they call inner city places, or like an uptown or a ghetto or something like that, where the violence isn't so much, a brawl in a country tavern or something like that. This might be more like gang violence, and they have to deal with that because there's access to firearms in a lot of urban settings too. However, what I'm talking about is what I know, what I've experienced in rural America, and what kind of things that men deal with. And we're not drawing them to this. We're either forcing them to go there, or we're keeping it a big secret where they have to make all these calls and they have to knock on a bunch of doors. And typically there's such a big waiting list, and there's so much bullshit that they have to go through in order to get in this system, that they don't think it's worth the time and the money and the effort to do it. And is it going to work? Because a lot of times people go through therapy and it does nothing for them, or it could be counterproductive. I've had some therapists, especially psychiatrists, who actually made me more crazy. And so it is a huge problem. And I don't have answers, I don't have solutions, but what I do have is I want to reveal a lot of problems that most people in the mental health community aren't aware of. So what's really funny is the fact that a lot of underprivileged people end up getting a lot of extra care and a lot of extra help. It's just that a lot of white men don't see it that way. They might see a lot of people of color, a lot of sexual minorities and women and other folks that seem to get a quote handout, for lack of a better term. And if they're losing their jobs or they have to work too hard for getting too less money and they can't provide for their family, it's going to seem like, whether it is or not, that they're being treated unfairly. And if they go into a situation where they're needing help because that's making them angry and they're getting the same thing of okay, you're a white male, but we seem to pay more attention to all these other people other than you, they're going to feel left out and they're not going to feel safe. So that's another thing too, is that it'd be great to have a whole separate organization, a whole separate model with different buildings that's totally away from the clinical mental health world, that not only makes men feel welcome, but reaches out to them. Because I believe, for instance, when it comes to, let's just say, random acts of violence, I believe there's a way that we could draw those men out ahead of time, because I don't think they want to do any of that stuff. It's just that they just, for whatever reason, didn't have anybody that gave them a way out. And what pisses me off more than feeling numb because of all the violent crime that's been going on over the last several years, and it's gotten to the point when it's like, okay, what's the next shooting now? I don't want to hear it. It's just normal now, and that scares me. But when they start interviewing friends and family, and it's usually the same story. Oh, well, this guy had a history of this and that and that. We tried to get him help or whatever, and he refused help. And I say, bullshit. I've had people tell me that I've refused help when I wasn't refusing help, because help just simply wasn't available. I was put on a waiting list. And I tell people that, and they don't get it. They don't understand that I didn't have access to mental health care for a lot of periods of time in my life. And even if they did have access to mental health care, did they feel safe? And when you're dealing with guys that have that much trauma and with those many needs, to get them to the point when they're going to do a random act of violence like that, then they're going to need a lot of care. They're going to need to feel safe. And here's the big thing. They're going to need to feel empowered. And that is very difficult, because when you're just telling somebody what to do, it's not going to empower them. And I don't see a lot of providers that know how to create that kind of environment. So if we not only create a model to draw men out, to make them feel safe and empowered, and to meet their needs when it comes to mental health, and of course it has to be close by, it has to be affordable, and there has to be a lot of this stuff, is we have to create a community. We have to create a community where guys are going to get together and feel like they can open up with each other, not necessarily in a group therapy type thing. And another thing too is that we have to make it, or another partner thing, Bible friendly, because we're dealing with Bible culture. And mental health practices in the last several years have its roots in Eastern thought, Eastern mysticism, and Eastern religions, which I love. But again, we're going to chase people away. And then we've got the secular right, where if you put a cross there, they're not going to feel safe there, because a lot of them have been abused by a lot of preachers. And I said this in another video too, is that most rural places that have mental health needs, a lot of men are going to go to the church, or they're going to go to the bartender. And those seem to be places where they actually do the work that a mental health provider should be doing. So it'd be interesting if we created a church just for that, or if we created a bar just for that. I think it'd be great to get really creative, and it'd be great to have men that can have activities that, that are geared towards men that are prone to violence, and they can get together and they can get out their aggressions in a healthy way. And there's so many things we could do if we just get creative and we talk to people. We go to these rural areas and we just say, hey, I'm an educated liberal snob. I don't understand your needs or your culture, but I'm here to help and listen and try to find something that'll work. Can you tell me how to do this? And it'd be fun if people would actually dare to do that. These sort of like mental health missionaries or something like that, but not there to tell everybody how to live their lives and this is how you meditate and this is how you do this. No, it says, hey, I want to learn how you guys can heal from your trauma, and based on what I know, that you can use me and all my education and all this stuff in order to find a way to help you to heal. And then it'll start breaking the cycle of trauma. And what happens, we'll have less abused kids that raise kids that aren't as abused, and we'll have less men going to jail, we'll have less violence. It'll take a long time though. So this is long-term stuff. The short-term stuff is going to be really tricky. And to create a place where you're finding either a way where there's no mandatory reporting or a moderate to light version of mandatory reporting, which would be really controversial. And I don't think that these people will end up being licensed. And I think that might be a good thing, because if somebody goes to a licensed therapist, then that might make them feel like, why do I want to share my problems, which are so far from somebody who's gone through all this licensing and education and stuff like that. The good thing about licensing is that they know their shit. And there's a lot of people, like I went to a therapist, and he was telling me a lot of layman's terms and a lot of made-up terms. And it turns out he got his license, but he had a doctorate in something else. And so I started correcting him on what his terminology is. I knew more about psychology than he did. And there's a chance that if somebody doesn't know a lot about psychology, then they could end up doing harm. And a lot of those things stem in what I call biblical counseling. And the biblical counseling model is really fucked up. I can say I've been a victim of it. It's basically, okay, tell me one little problem that you have, and I'm going to interrupt you, and I'm just going to preach at you with all these Bible scriptures. Is basically my experience with biblical counseling. I'm sure there are some that have a more compassionate view, and there's some that probably do have a background in psychology that are helpful, but I think that can help maybe some people if hearing the Bible is the only thing that makes them feel safe. And there's a huge amount of people in the Western world who, if you quote the Bible, then they feel safe. They feel like I can open up because that's my world, that's my context. And then at the same time, a lot of people you quote the Bible to, they're going to, fuck you, I'm going to run out the door here. So that's why it'd be great to have the secular right type outreach and the biblical right type outreach to reach two types of demographics. You got your bar people and your church people. When you're in rural America, occasionally, you get some, libertarian stoner out there who's not into either one of those. But how do we do outreach? Do we just put posters around? Do we do social media? Do we put stuff on TV? You have to put a lot of money into marketing, but I think we can market this stuff. And I think we could do it on a grassroots and a local level. And I think we could also do a lot of word of mouth and get a lot of people to do a lot of referrals, especially when it comes to, like, if somebody walks into a mental health office, the first thing to ask them, hey, would you like this model where we're going to give you this type of provider and this type of model or whatever it is, or here's a business card of a place that you can call. They're not necessarily licensed, but they might be able to meet you where you're at. And that might be the lesser of two evils for some, because if a guy is going to reject getting group therapy, medication, psychotherapy, whatever it is, because of obvious reasons that I've mentioned, we've got to create an alternative to say, hey, if you don't feel safe talking to these people about your problems, then let's create something else. Let's call it the den or something like that. And you just got this rundown shack with a bunch of old couches and a fridge full of beer, and you sit down and you can do something helpful for a guy to meet him on his level that you wouldn't be able to do in another setting. So I don't know how that's going to look, and I doubt anybody will have the guts to actually create something like that. But that would be really cool, especially if it worked. And chances are there is a lot of risk involved in creating a different model, because in all mental health work and all psychology, it's kind of like surgery. You're opening somebody up and you're taking things out and you're putting things in their head. And a bad surgeon is going to leave a wrench in somebody and sew them up. And it's the same thing with a lot of bad counselors. Is some of these guys have put some real bullshit in my head over the years, and you just never know what kind of energy they have, what kind of motives they have, and it's going to be really hard to create a situation. But here's the thing, is that the goal should be undermining violent crime in men. And if it means having an environment that's not politically correct, if it means taking down all your rainbow flags and making all of us gay people feel safe, we need to make everybody feel safe. And if that means making an entirely different environment to make a demographic that's at risk to feel safe, maybe we can compromise some of our pet liberal stuff that we love to hold on to, because that is the dominant force, the dominant culture, and the dominant influence in the mental health industry. And I think if people were to just start from there and to say, hey, this is how we come off, we're running people away, how do we change that? And I think we can start there, and hopefully we can come up with something that might actually work. Maybe we can test it out somewhere. And I wish I had the power and the funds and the influence to actually see something like that happen. But in the meantime, these are just ideas that I'm throwing out there, and I hope it causes people to think and to reconsider where we're at and why things are so fucked up right now, and why is it that when it comes to the gun issue that a lot of conservatives talk about the failed mental health system. Well, a lot of people don't like to see that because they think that the mental health system is available for people and it works. And I can say that from my experience in rural and urban settings, it barely works. And it has failed, and I've had to learn a lot of self-care, and I've had to help a lot of other people who can't get care in order to try to find care for them. I've been a peer support specialist in a recognized setting for a very short time, but I find that most of the work I do as a peer support person is just people that I meet in the gay community, people I meet in the music community, people I meet in rural communities that I talk to, and they have a lot of questions about mental health and nobody will answer them. And it's sad because it's everywhere I go. I will find it. And if they don't go to violence, a lot of times they go to drugs. And if you think that meth and a lot of hard drugs is an urban problem, you haven't been to the country yet. You don't know what hillbilly heroin is. And it's amazing. Some of these rural communities, you get out in the middle of fucking nowhere, and there is so much meth use, it is unbelievable. And these folks have no other way, they have no other options that's available to them that makes them feel safe, that will actually help their needs, that's the only way that they can escape from the torment of living with trauma, living with paranoia, living with anger and rage. And these drugs are basically the only thing that they have that give them a reason to live. That's pretty darn sad. And then when they get really fucked up because of that, then we send them into a recovery program, and boom, they get this system, this industry that doesn't cater towards their culture, and they go back and forth from recovery because they don't get help, because they don't feel like anybody can meet them where they're at and relate to them. And that's what it's about.